Contrary to popular belief, Scandinavians do indeed have a culture and history and language and traditions and practices, just like every other people group on Earth. But looking at the modern Scandinavian nations today, one wouldn't be remiss to point out that the average Swede would be completely unrecognizable compared to their ancestors. Indeed, as opposed to the innovative and tolerant society we see today, only several hundred years ago, this land was a harsh and unforgiving society, by far one of the most ruthless people to ever walk the earth, feared throughout Europe and beyond as the Vikings. But hey, much like the Germans, the Scandinavians have worked hard to reverse this image of marauding conquerors, being the epitome of the old Roman description of the barbarians of their time. But rather than approaching their past with shame or apathy, as many are rife to do these days, many Scandinavians, especially those in the diaspora, are expressing great interest in their ancestors' reputation as plunderers, explorers, and fierce combatants. So, whatever happened to this destructive force of humanity that we know as the Vikings, and how did they evolve into the modern people groups we see in Northern Europe today? Well, it was only a couple videos ago that I discussed the ethnogenesis of the Germanic peoples in continental Europe, particularly the German, Austrian, and Swiss peoples, who are often grouped together under the umbrella of the Greater German nation, and it's known that the original Proto-Germanic people originated from the peninsula of Scandinavia, which, as a strictly geographic descriptor, describes this area of Europe here, which branches out into two different peninsulas in the south. This is a part of a greater peninsula known as Fennoscandia, which stretches further east, jutting out in the far north of the Eurasian landmass, and is only connected to continental Europe through Eurasia to the east, being around 100 kilometers or so from Denmark to the south. However, in the distant past, around 6000 BC, Scandinavia would have been connected to continental Europe in the west as well, with the Baltic Sea being one massive lake. It's believed that the Indo-Europeans didn't enter Europe, though, until around 4000 BC, long after the Øresund Strait was flooded, separating the two, with the Proto-Germanic peoples arriving in Scandinavia a couple thousand years after this, interacting with the surrounding Finno-Ugrians to the northeast, with it being debated whether the Proto-Germanic or Proto-Euralians were the first to arrive in the Scandinavian peninsula, although Indo-Europeans likely predated the Finns and Sami in Fennoscandia. The early Euralians, as I discussed in a past video, are an interesting people originating in the Far East, however, had become heavily mixed in their migration throughout northern Eurasia, and by the time they would have interacted with the first Proto-Germanic Scandinavians, they would have mostly been predominantly Western Eurasian, genetically speaking. The northern Germanic peoples began to split from the southern Germanic peoples of the mainland around 1000 AD, with a distinct culture and identity forming among this people, being one of the northernmost peoples of Europe, basically on the fringes of the civilized world, and this greatly impacted their mythology and folklore. The traditional religion of these northern Germanic tribes, who would soon come to be known as the Norse, became quite well known throughout much of Europe, with the central figures of Norse paganism like Thor or Odin tied to many other figures in other branches of European paganism. Due to the extremely cold and harsh terrain and climate, many of the Norse tribes had a reputation of infighting and raiding neighboring peoples, but never really grew to be much more than a nuisance. However, with the advancement of sailing and navigational technology in the 8th century AD, a whole new realm opened up to this aggressively expansive population, and coupled with the conquests of other Germanic tribes on the mainland, the Vikings, who were not a single nation, culture, or political power, but rather the name given to all Norse raiders, would soon begin sowing havoc throughout the Western world. Spreading out along the coast of Scandinavia, the Vikings would begin to colonize further north and into the interior of the peninsula, which had previously been inhabited by the Sami, and some of the first areas that the Vikings arrived at outside of Scandinavia were along the Baltic coast, such as in modern-day Germany and Lithuania, as well as their neighbors in the British Isles to the west, raiding and settling not only in England, but also parts of Scotland, such as in the north and the Hebrides, Ireland, and the Isle of Man, lying in between Ireland and Great Britain, with an especially large impact on this rather small island. Of particular note are the small collection of islands in the North Sea between Scandinavia and Great Britain, divided into three main archipelagos, that being the Shetland and Orkney Islands in the south, and the Faroe Islands in the north, being some of the most remote islands in all of Europe. For centuries, many Vikings would rush the mainland of Great Britain, sacking towns and kidnapping young men for slaves and women for war brides, whom they would either take back to Scandinavia or onto these remote islands, essentially meaning that virtually the entire population of these small islands were initially birthed by, well, you get the idea. In Iceland, out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the initial population were actually Celtic monks from Ireland. However, the Vikings quickly took over this island in the 9th and 10th centuries, and to this day, it's been found that in the Faroe Islands, the gene pool is split nearly evenly between Norse and Celtic DNA, with a similarly large Celtic influence in Iceland as well, with the vast majority of the maternal ancestry being from the British Isles, while the paternal ancestry derives from Scandinavia, with haplogroup I1 being the dominant haplogroup in Scandinavian populations and heavily tied with this population, as opposed to R1b for the rest of Western Europe. Although the Vikings were eventually expelled out of Great Britain or absorbed into the population, their legacy remained for quite some time, with the Scandinavian dialect known as Norn actually surviving in northern Scotland as well as the Shetland and Orkney Islands until the mid-1800s before being replaced by Scots and English. One of the most interesting and remote Viking settlements that's a testimony to their exploring nature would be those in Greenland and Vinland in modern Canada and North America, although these communities would be entirely wiped out through famine caused mostly by changing climates in the 13th century. Even though it's been heavily speculated that some Vikings may have survived long enough to have intermixed with some Native Americans, and hence survived genetically even if their civilization had been wiped out, as I discussed in the past, it's extremely unlikely that the Vikings of Greenland ever mixed with the Inuit people of the past, but it has been found that the average Greenlandic Inuit has around 25 to 33% European DNA, but rather than being derived from the Old Norse, this is all almost certainly from later Scandinavian traders and explorers who settled in Greenland from the 1800s onwards. Sometimes Viking settlements would eventually take on the local customs of the nations they conquered, such as in Normandy, with the Normans being a French population with very strong Norse influence and distinct local customs, with the Normans eventually going on to conquer the whole of England, as well as Sicily and parts of northern Africa from the Moors. The Kievan Rus was also an example of a Norse elite that would eventually take on the language and religion of the local population, and Viking raiders traveled through much of the Volga region and the Caspian, even making it as far as Persia. But all maybe not so good things must come to an end, and the days of Viking raids throughout Europe would dwindle upon the spread of Christianity to Scandinavia. This wasn't an overnight transformation, as although many kings and clans became nominally Christian, it took some time for the religion to actually be embraced by the public, mostly due to the incorporation of much of the native Scandinavian culture, which made it much easier for the traditionally fiery society to accept. After Christianization, Scandinavia established kingdoms much in the same style as other Western Europeans, and the history of unification, alliances, and unions between the three kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden is quite complicated to say the least, as at various points you had a united Denmark-Norway, Norway-Sweden, Sweden-Finland, and at one point, all of them under the Kalmar Union. The various modern Scandinavian languages are much like the continental Germanic dialects to the south, traditionally having a gradation between the different dialects, with the Scanian dialect of southern Sweden being the most similar to Danish, while you also have the Old Gutnish dialect on the island of Gotland in the Baltic being the most distinct of any Scandinavian language in Europe. But of particular interest are the Faroese and Icelandic languages, which, although originally based on Western Norwegian dialects, due to their distance and isolation from the rest of Europe, have diverged and evolved into truly unique languages. There are over 14 million people of Norse descent outside of Scandinavia today, mostly in North America, such as in the United States and Canada, and I actually did an entire video about the region of America with the highest percentage of Scandinavian descendants, a contiguous area in the Midwestern states of Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, and northern Michigan, an area I dubbed Scandamerica, where Scandinavian descendants make up around 30 to 60% of the population. Their history is closely tied with the German immigrants from Europe to the Midwest, largely settling in the same communities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and intermixing extensively, to the point that the average person in the upper Midwest is of mixed Norse-German descent, and this is apparent in the culture, cuisine, appearance, with the area having the highest proportion of those with blue or green eyes, as well as blonde hair in the United States, as well as the local accent, with the upper Midwest having a very distinct dialect of American English that has been heavily influenced by Scandinavian languages. But it's not just America where you'll find huge numbers of Norse descendants, as neighboring Canada also has a large number, especially in the prairie region, with Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta having very interesting Icelandic, Swedish, and Norwegian settlements stretching back over a century. Perhaps most interesting of all, though, is the settlement of Scandinavians to the south, with Latin America having over 1 million people of Scandinavian descent, predominantly in the southern cone, where they intermingled, once again, mostly with German communities in southern Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. Although the Vikings truly had some insane feats in the conquest of much of Europe and beyond, and explored parts of the planet that even today remain some of the most isolated, inhospitable corners of the globe, it's unlikely that even they could have predicted what kind of impact their descendants would have had on the world, including lands so disparate from their homeland. So the Vikings never really went away. They just had a change in lifestyle, from the great conquerors of old to the furniture makers and innovative researchers of today. And although their culture was quite brutal, it was also a culture that encouraged exploration, discovery, and trade, giving their modern descendants something to be proud of. So go ahead and let me know your thoughts on the Vikings and their modern Scandinavian progeny in Europe and abroad. And for today's poll, let me know which Scandinavian group you find to be the most interesting. And as always, thanks for watching, everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.